if you ever want to understand what desire is from a kind of Marxist point of view, check out Hannah Proctor's wonderful essay in the Sage Handbook, kind of like an encyclopedia of concepts of Marxism. She wrote the entry on desire. I highly recommend that. Now, today we want to chat about a recent presentation that Hannah gave at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry in Berlin, or ICI Berlin, which is, what is the title of it? Case Studies from Below, Class Struggle in the Psychoanalytic Consulting Room. So Hannah, I want to kind of kick things off. I think viewers and listeners will be familiar with Elizabeth Danto's Freud's Free Clinics.
Mm-hmm.
Can we start off with a little bit of a kind of historical context? Because what I see you trying to do in this lecture is sort of say, well, psychoanalysts have really not really read class into the famous case studies that we have been given. So there's that aspect, but then there's also this sort of historical context of the early institutional growth of psychoanalysis. And we know from Danto that it was like a very deeply socialistic kind of context in which it was emerging. Could you sort of start off by painting a bit of that picture, perhaps, for us?
Yeah, so this is a paper, it's called Case Histories from Below, which is a kind of pun because it's an attempt to think about case histories using the methods, or at least the political approach of a kind of history from below, which is a sort of, a history that's interested in the history of the marginalized and the oppressed, and that reads documents in an attempt to kind of excavate those histories, including documents that might have been written by people who were powerful, for example. And so this was a sort of slightly joking title. So it's in the paper. It's kind of a paper that I really struggled with, because I had this idea that I wanted to explore case histories in this way, and I first had the idea because I had read some examples of case histories where the patient explicitly voices a kind of frustration with psychoanalysis and sort of explicitly says, this is just bourgeois nonsense. And then within the case history itself, it's kind of brushed off by the analyst as like, oh, well, this is just evidence of your own sort of defensiveness and da 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 da. But that was my sort of starting point. And then I was thinking about, the paper itself is, like a kind of example of me trying and failing to do something, and starting over and trying again and thinking, okay, what's a better way of getting at this? And so one of the various starting points I had was to think about, well, it's a kind of cliche, I guess, about psychoanalysis in some respects, and that it's a sort of form of bourgeois individualism, and that the archetypical psychoanalytic patient is a bourgeois subject. It's certainly true in many times and places that psychoanalysis is also just simply expensive. It's expensive to train, and it's expensive to access analytic treatment. That obviously varies from within different times and places. And I was giving the lecture in Germany, where actually you are able to access psychoanalysis via your public health insurance, whereas now I live in the UK, where that's very much not the case. So I was interested in those kinds of, just that kind of question. Well, okay. And I was aware that, of course, there is this early history of psychoanalysis in Berlin, actually, where in the very early days of psychoanalysis, there was an attempt to kind of create these free clinics and to kind of make psychoanalysis available to people who were not bourgeois.
Mm-hmm.
And so Elizabeth Danto's book looks, a lot of it talks about the polyclinic movement in Berlin, and this kind of what Russell Jacoby describes as the second generation of psychoanalysts. So these are people who were sort of, their own kind of political formation was within the sort of German and Austrian student movements, actually Hungarian as well. People who were born usually in the late 19th century, a generation younger than sort of Freud and his peers. And that I think there's also this emphasis on, like, actually some of them were Austrian, but they moved to Germany, where they felt they were a little bit distanced from what was kind of going on in Vienna, and were able to maybe experiment a little bit more. And so I was sort of interested in, well, even from its very, very early days, there was this kind of counter free clinic movement going on. There was an attempt to make psychoanalysis available to people. And I suppose I was interested in thinking about, because there's also, I guess you could argue, that there's also a sort of theoretical engagement between psychoanalysis and Marxism from the very beginning as well.
Yeah.
And there's lots of these people are themselves, they're not really communists, most of them are social democrats.
Right.
But they're like on the left, and they're kind of, and they're not just sort of vaguely on the left, they're like engaged in political movements, and psychoanalysis within Austria is taking place within the context of sort of Red Vienna, and I guess I was interested in thinking about that kind of the sort of, because I'm a historian ultimately, I'm not really a theory person, so I guess I'm always interested in that sort of contextual stuff.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and your book on Luria is very interesting. I mean, it's been somewhat interesting because the Bolshevik Revolution, a lot of the theoreticians, including Trotsky, in his work on cultural revolution, he speaks pretty positively of psychoanalysis. Although obviously there's a lot of, maybe we could say, more vulgar Marxist readings of Freud that certainly proliferate at that time. Can you talk a little bit about Bolshevism and that early, like, how did the Bolsheviks treat Freud's system? For how do they see it in the context of trying to build a new society? Like, can you say some broad things about that, perhaps?
Okay, I'll try. So,
I know it's a very broad question, but you really, like, you write so much about it. So I think maybe it's just some general things would be cool.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, Trotsky was also in Vienna before the revolution. He was in Vienna in this kind of context of Red Vienna. A prominent Bolshevik, and Trotsky's friend, Joffa, was in analysis with Adler, who was someone who would go on to kind of split from Freud, but was himself also on the left. And Adler was married to a Russian kind of person on the left as well. So there are these kind of like quite interpersonal connections between these kind of milieu, if you like, which I think is important to bear in mind, that and so, and Sabina Spielrein is she was in analysis with Freud. There's that David Cronenberg film, A Dangerous Method, where she's played by Keira Knightley. But what that film doesn't show is that after this kind of early experience, she actually became a psychoanalyst, and then she also returned to she's Russian, she returned to the Soviet Union. And so again, there's these kind of like interpersonal connections.
And some people say, I mean, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, remember the footnote where Freud credits her as really the first to kind of throw down a notion of what he would develop under the concept of the death drive.
Yeah, she wrote this essay called Destruction of the Cause of Coming into Being, I think it's called. It's very Nietzschean. It's a very it's a really interesting essay. It's available in English, and yeah, it's definitely interesting. And yeah, exactly, he footnotes her. So anyway, so then there are kind of two main books about the kind of fate of psychoanalysis in the Soviet Union. One of them is by Alexander Etkind, which was it was published in Russian, like really just after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, translated into English a few years later in like the late 90s. And then there's another book by Martin Miller called Freud and the Bolsheviks. And these books, I think, tell a kind of similar-ish story of, in slightly different styles, but there's a lot of overlaps of the kind of early and short-lived psychoanalytic community that existed in Russia, and it was just in Russia, I think, rather than, I suppose they talk a bit about Georgia actually, but in the early Soviet Union anyway, after the revolution, there was a small community, mostly in Moscow, a few people also based in Leningrad, and Luria himself had originally started a small psychoanalytic circle in Kazan. But I think, yeah, there were a lot of kind of debates about, well, how can we make psychoanalysis fit with Marxism? And some of those arguments, I think, were fairly crude. Just they were like, Freud's work is revolutionary, and so therefore it fits with our revolutionary. Because some of them really are as kind of crude as that. But I think, yeah, I think I've written a bit about the introduction that Luria and his collaborator Lev Vygotsky wrote to Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which was translated into Russian in 1925, and the argument that they make that they have to kind of concede, like, yes, we see that the death drive seems like very conservative and backward looking, but actually, if you think about the relationship between the life instinct, or eros, and the death instincts, then this is actually a dialectical relationship, and that this actually kind of propels the organism forward, and they kind of make an argument that I suppose that isn't unfamiliar to people who've probably read other kind of left-wing theories of psychoanalysis. That's basically like, well, the problem is that Freud developed this theory within a bourgeois context, and so of course the kind of subjects that he was describing were themselves bourgeois and had these kind of conservative tendencies. But they argue that, if you completely transform society and you change the family, for example, then the subject will in turn transform. That's the kind of argument that I guess they're making.
And I guess Wilhelm Reich is a part of that too. I mean, he gave lectures in the Soviet Union, and yeah, I mean, what do you make of this, like, in retrospect, like looking back, like how do you appraise the Soviet attempt? Was it kind of aborted attempt of implementing? Were there any examples where psychoanalysis furthered something quite sound or progressive or interesting within the wider Bolshevik movement? Or is it did it remain just kind of more of a speculative project that didn't fully affect what was going on, per se on the ground?
Yeah, I would say it was a fairly small kind of community of people. And yes, someone like Trotsky was interested in, trying to combine Pavlovian understanding of conditioned reflexes with a psychoanalytic understanding of the unconscious, for example. And I think it was I think taking place more on a kind of intellectual level.
Yeah.
And that it was also, these were not people who were trained as analysts. They were not practicing as psychoanalysts. Mm-hmm. They were kind of talking about psychoanalytic texts, translating psychoanalytic texts. They were doing some interesting work. There was a children's home that was sponsored by a German miners' union, I think, which was housed in this extraordinary building, which was eventually given to Maxim Gorky, and which is now the Gorky Museum. It was kind of this magnificent Art Nouveau mansion that had been confiscated from an industrialist after the revolution. And it briefly housed the Russian Psychoanalytic Society and this kind of experimental children's home, which was run by a woman called Vera Schmidt. And so, but this is obviously, the number of children that went to that children's home is minuscule. Yeah. And so I think it, in terms of the kind of, I don't think you could probably claim that there was a sort of concrete influence that they had on kind of politics. Yeah, I don't think you could say that.
And then I recently have been drawn to Etienne Balibar's. This is sort of very much related to what we're talking about, but Balibar's incredible essay, I don't know if you've seen it, called The Invention of the Superego, where he looks, he basically makes an interesting argument. And he says, it's really important to understand Freud from the point of 1920 to 1923, because in that moment where The Ego and the Id in 23 is later published, and then Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, Freud has polemical engagements with a conservative liberal jurist named Hans Kelsen. And Hans Kelsen criticized and lambasted Freud's group psychology and social writings because he saw them as antinomian, as like there's no normative principle here. And that actually he was suggesting that psychoanalysis is really giving kind of credence to the Soviet councils and to Bolshevism. And of course, there's a racial dynamic there because Freud's Jewish. So he's Jewish and he's Bolshevik, or like the theory lends itself to a Bolshevik kind of orientation in a way. And that was really interesting to me because then Balibar says, well, in a way, you could read the superego almost as Freud's response to Kelsen as like a kind of conservative regulating principle in a way. Anyways, Balibar may or may not be right about that, but it's a kind of interesting kind of way of looking at, Freud's own kind of politics in relationship to, how he develops his concepts and his ideas and things like this. What do you make? Because in Danto's Freud's Free Clinics, it kind of becomes, and one of the things I just want to say about that book that really interests me, you notice that the American foundations, philanthropic foundations, were really behind, even back then, in that early time, they were really behind the supporting of psychoanalytic free services for the masses, which I found fascinating. But all of that socialistic, social democracy basis of psychoanalysis kind of disappears. And so you have this weird tension internal to psychoanalysis of this kind of like bourgeois aristocratism with also, how do you balance that dynamic with a kind of more socialistic dynamic? And I wonder what you think about those internal dynamics, and like how do psychoanalysts balance that issue, if that makes sense? I don't know, because a lot of your work is looking at how psychoanalysts, when they read, for example, case studies, do they read the underclass or the class position or the racial position or the subjected aspect of the, and oftentimes, as you argue, they don't read that in there. So what do you think about that? Like, why do you see psychoanalysis as having that I guess, not to be too strong, but bourgeois aristocratic tendency? If that may be too strong, but maybe it's not. What do you think?
I don't know. I think I'm still kind of trying to puzzle it out a little bit, because of course there are always exceptions, and there are so many examples of individual psychoanalysts who were obviously interested in these questions. I suppose that old Russell Jacoby book talks about Otto Fenichel and that whole circle of people that Danto also talks about, who were kind of in that kind of free clinic context. And he had these famous Rundbriefe that he sent to his circle of kind of left-wing analysts. But in that book, which came out in the 80s, I think, Jacoby makes this argument that, like, the Second World War happens, all these people scatter, they go into exile, and they have to flee Berlin, they have to flee, and some of them have to flee like kind of various places in succession, right? And then a lot of them end up in the US eventually, but the kind of political convictions of their early years remain suppressed in their published writings. And then you have a figure like Reich, who kind of breaks away from the psychoanalytic establishment and retains a kind of political radicalism, and then is taken up by the left very enthusiastically later as well, in the sort of late 60s and early 70s. But he's kind of trying to look at, well, what happened to the politics of these people who were so involved in this movement and so kind of committed to the social kind of application of psychoanalysis. Maybe that application is the wrong word, but the kind of and sort of, well, why was it that they were so like that, so that sort of aspect of their work became so muffled in later years? And I suppose there is a historical way of looking at that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, Reich is such a godfather of what the new left would do with psychoanalysis, running all the way up to Deleuze and Guattari, like, but obviously before then too, his influence in the Soviet context. And it's interesting too, if you study the relationship between Freud and Reich, Freud really saw Reich as one of his leading lights, one of his top disciples, right?
Yeah.
And there's that crazy story in the biography of Wilhelm Reich, where he witnessed, you may remember this, he witnessed a police um, riot in Vienna, I believe, and some innocent bystanders were murdered, and he witnessed it with his own eyes. And then, he goes back to Freud and asks for Freud's insights. And Freud, the kind of moderate liberal conservative that he is, didn't really give Reich an adequate sort of answer. Basically, he basically kind of fell back on this sort of kind of opposition to I don't know, like the masses in revolt, like the whole notion that the masses would have a justified reason for revolting for Freud is to be under suspicion itself, right? Like we need to go prior to that and ask how society can be structured such that that doesn't happen in a way. And that's, Reich actually says that's part of what drew him to Marxism. So maybe you could chat a little bit or say a little bit about Reich, because you've written about a little bit about Wilhelm Reich. What do you, obviously,
I'm really not a Reich expert, and I think in some ways part of what I've been trying to do recently is excavate some less well-known figures who are kind of also like communist psychoanalysts. So on my newsletter, I've done some little pieces about, for this, a psychoanalyst called Marie Langer, for example, who ended up in being a very major figure in Argentinian psychoanalysis. And I'm sort of, I guess, interested also in sort of also people who maybe they didn't maintain the same political convictions, but had this kind of early Marxist orientation. And those are people who were kind of around Reich, including actually Annie Reich, who was his kind of ex-wife. But yeah, I suppose it's tricky to talk about Reich because some of his later theories are so easy to kind of parody and make fun of, this kind of his ideas about orgon and all of these kind of cultural representations of the sort of orgon accumulator and this kind of idea of this sort of mystical cosmic energy. It's sort of the kind of the trajectory that took him from his earlier engagements in psychoanalysis and his work in the kind of sex pole work to that later slightly more wacky stuff is kind of hard to.
But his stuff on sex pole is interesting because it's all centered on this kind of orgiastic. I mean, he centers the importance of the orgasm as a means for a kind of break from the bourgeois repression of society. And one of the things you do write about is how actually Marcuse would later develop his notion of repressive desublimation and stuff like that, actually in a way which is very different than Reich's theory. So it was a nice contrast you made there, because in that contrast you see the difference between one Marxist psychoanalytic analysis of how to deal with repression in capitalism versus another. And I kind of wonder if you might just say in basic terms, sort of could you sort of speak about those 2 points of view?
It's a long time since I've written about this, so I'll have to try to remember. I mean, there's this quite funny bit in Marcuse where he sort of says that having sex in a field is good, but having sex in a car is bad, because I think it's an irrational civilization. You read it and you're like, what? He basically says it's the mechanized environment of the car.
Yeah,
is it's not natural, and so
right.
there's this kind of. And I think, look, where Reich is really kind of celebrating kind of the most sort of orgiastic kind of I guess almost advocating for a sort of set, exploring and getting in touch with a kind of polymorphous perversity and all of this stuff. Marcuse doesn't think that at all. I think it's much more of a staid and kind of restrained understanding. That I think he kind of valorizes a lost past of kind of natural, unrepressed distance, but doesn't. I think that they have, quite different understandings of.
Because you write about how I think the idea was that, commodification of everyday life, of, the proliferation of, um, you know, consumer capitalism, basically, is itself eroticizing in a way, right?
Mhm.
So like, but that eroticization of everyday life is actually, for Marcuse, not necessarily, um, the solution is not necessarily a kind of Dionysian embrace of a kind of, or is it, or is, because I often wonder about that in Marcuse, like, in other words, because he theorizes the drive almost through this kind of drive as instinct, or drive as a kind of biological natural category. Sometimes you do get the sense that, he's thinking that, I guess this is my question, is he thinking that revolution against capitalism in a total sense will allow us to enter into a different form of eroticism, or erotic relationality, maybe, than what we are subjected to in capitalism? I think, is that kind of how you would sort of maybe summarize what he's saying there?
Yeah, so I think it's, so he's obviously saying repression isn't like natural or biological. Repression is historical, and repression exists in it's enforced, and it's not a necessity, and it's not like, which I guess is different from a kind of orthodox psychoanalytic position, maybe, that like you kind of have to be repressed or you just go around like murdering everyone or something. That he's saying that there would be a form of what he calls non-repressive sublimation, sorry, in a society that is not repressive, i.e., not capitalist, and he calls that an eroticization of the entire personality. But my sense is that and that sounds like, I mean, but I think when you read what he actually means by that, I think he kind of is explicit, like, oh, don't worry, it's not just going to be a society of, he uses the phrase sex maniacs, that it's not going to lead to this society of sex maniacs. Whereas I think actually Reich's understanding of a kind of liberated society is a society of, well, maybe not maniacs, but kind of like, I think this is where and so when he says eroticization of the entire personality, I think it's a kind of, yeah, exactly. It's like eros it should be understood in this quite broad sense, and and so yeah, I guess that's the distinction, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like a kind of profound, two ships passing in the night when it comes to Marcuse and the New Left, in the sense that there's this kind of cartoon version of his argument that has infiltrated into what Ellen Wills calls the cultural unconscious, which she has this really beautiful idea that, the legacy of the New Left for cultural politics today kind of we still deal with the kind of permutations or residues of those big 60s era debates. And one of them is this notion of the kind of leisurely hippie, bohemian punk kid who doesn't have to work, and is just given this kind of free time to sort of tune in and drop out.
Mm-hmm.
And then Marcuse is associated with the kind of father that permits that lifestyle to happen, right? So that's his whole injunction to the 68 kids, in a certain sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because Reich, in his early time, was really more workerist. Like, he was really more like trying to say the bourgeois repressive apparatus. And you see this in Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is why he's actually giving free sex clinics and trying to encourage things like masturbation, for
Mm-hmm.
example, right? So it's interesting cultural contrast, because the post-war welfare state in the West, that Marcuse is dealing with is actually very different than the repressive state apparatus of the pre-Nazi period that Reich is dealing with, right?
Yeah.
And like that contrast is like historically significant. And do you agree with that? Because I know that like in psychoanalysis, there's a huge thing of like, how do you historically periodize like the social superego, for example, right? What do you make of that kind of like, I guess, yeah, how do you navigate these kind of bigger historical questions of what periodization ultimately?
Well, I think that there's a kind of book or something to be written about the reception of Reich in those scenes, because
Mhm.
if you read anything in that period, Reich is everywhere. Everyone is reading Reich,
Mm.
and like in the 60s and 70s, and
Yeah.
like if you read like lots of like women's liberation movement texts and kind of and I don't know, I feel like there's a kind of something to be done, I think, into trying to track that influence, because I
Yeah.
think there is this kind of anachronistic Reich that exists in that period, and that who
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
taken up within the 60s and 70s. And yes, it's often texts that he wrote decades earlier that were about a very, very different historical moment. But I guess there is also within the kind of the movements of, like, if you read like I guess there is also a reckoning with the legacies of Nazism within as a kind of something that was from a the parents' generation. That is,
Mm.
I think, why there's a kind of urgency to return to texts that did deal with that
Yeah.
historical moment in the 60s and 70s. So I think it's kind of that. I think there's a kind of question about why Reich was read as a very contemporary author in this
Yeah.
late period, and how much, I guess, our own understanding of Reich is also refracted through
Yeah.
that.
I mean, think about it from the standpoint of pop culture for a moment. I mean, the VW van, the doctor of love, driving around giving free healing to people suffering in society. I'm sorry to say it mirrors the, the hippie in the 60s in a way, right? It's a kind of weird kind of composite model. Like it's there is something to be written there. I totally agree with you. And then of course, like for the avant-garde, Wilhelm Reich was very important as well. Even
Mm-hmm.
his later cockamamie stuff, which was almost like at the level of like theosophical mysticism in a way, like William S. Burroughs loved the late Reich. He didn't really care for much. He actually liked the crazy Reich, right? That was his preference, and he had an orgon accumulator, right, and stuff like that. So these are like serious intellectuals that like followed Reich, and of course, there's a Wilhelm Reich museum in Maine because that's where he was exiled. And
Mm-hmm.
I actually had the theory that part of his cockamamie turn probably had to do with the fact that he was persecuted by the state in a way. I think that anxiety and that pressure probably wore on him in a certain way. And he was so ostracized and exiled and othered in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so anyways, but yeah, so let's actually make a pivot back to Luria for a moment. What drew your attention to this figure? And can you just give us a little snapshot of, because hardly anybody knows about Luria. Could you just sort of introduce his world, who he is, why he is of interest to you?
Yeah, so Luria was a Soviet neuropsychologist. That was his term for what he did, and he worked in many, many different fields, often because the sort of twists and turns of Soviet history necessitated that he switch discipline. At certain points, it would become it was dangerous to work in certain fields, for example, and so he actually trained as a neurologist in the 1930s when certain psychological approaches were denounced, and so I think, and he also did a lot of work, with in what we would, I guess, call like developmental psychology, kind of like working with children. So I first encountered Luria in a kind of quite passing comment in a book by Catherine Malabou, the French philosopher, years ago. And she talks about this case history. So she works on the concept of plasticity. And she's written lots about that in the kind of the work of Hegel, but she's also written about it within neuroscience. And so she cited this actually incredible case history by Luria, which is called The Man with the Shattered World, which is about a patient of his who he worked with for many, many years, who was a Red Army soldier who survived a bullet wound to the head, and who had a very particular form of aphasia, and who Luria worked with over many years to kind of try to help him regain his lost world, which is the name of the title of the Russian book is more similar to that, A World Lost and Regained. And so I was interested in how Malibu talks about this case history sort of in passing and in a quite depoliticized way. And I was sort of interested in reading Luria within the context of that he was working, which was in the Soviet Union. But the way that I originally imagined that I might do that was to do it in a very theoretical way, because, you know, my starting point was reading about him in the work by a philosopher. And so I started doing that. I started reading his work and reading about, well, how did he theorize, like how a theory of the individual subject and the individual individual consciousness and human development, how did he kind of understand that in a kind of Marxist sense? And I was also intrigued because his collaborator Lev Vygotsky actually is very influential in the West and became so mostly through Luria kind of writing to people in the West and getting stuff translated. And so there is this sort of this version of Soviet psychology, this very particular school of it, which is usually known in kind of the Anglophone context as cultural historical psychology. That it is known and it is practiced, and you would be taught these thinkers if you did a very mainstream kind of psychiatry degree, or if you trained to be a teacher in Britain, for example, you would learn about their approaches, but without any context in terms of the fact that they were Soviet, the fact that they were Marxist. And so I guess I was interested in well, in what way were they Marxist? What did it mean?
Yeah.
And in the process of doing that, and so Luria he lived a lot longer than Vygotsky. Vygotsky died in 1934. Luria died in 1977. And he was much less of a kind of theory person in a way. Like Vygotsky, if you read his work, it's kind of laced with references to Spinoza, Hegel, Shakespeare. Whereas Luria's work was more clinical. And so I actually found that trying to approach him as this kind of theorist of a Marxist understanding of the mind or whatever didn't really make any sense, because actually what came through much more strongly when you read his work was that he was working with specific people who had experienced specific historical circumstances, which were actually very dramatic because they were living through Soviet history, which was, at least in its kind of early decades, these are people who he was working. So he did, for example, some experiments in what is today Uzbekistan in Soviet Central Asia, where he was trying to trace the cognitive impact of collectivization, and the mass literacy campaigns. And so it seemed kind of crazy to me to actually just read him as a sort of theorist, because actually what was coming through when I read his work was that he was working in these very particular circumstances, and that theoretically, he always says, the human mind is shaped by historical circumstances, by the environment. And, it's sort of Marxist in that sense, that people are shaped by the worlds in which they grew up in, and by their kind of social relations, by the kind of class that they live in, etc., etc. But then actually I found that if you read his work, the kind of conclusions of his clinical work, it doesn't always bear that out. He often actually didn't seem to take that into account whatsoever. And that might partly have been because of constraints in terms of what he was able to write. But I sort of didn't, I just sort of took the texts at face value in some sense and was like, well, okay, so what would it mean to then try to situate those texts in that kind of history in a sense? And they do give glimpses into the worlds of the people that he's encountering through his patients. And so I think I became more interested in that. And so I focused on he's published a huge amount of work, but I focused on a very small number that all had a kind of particular type of subject at their center, if that makes sense. And so I think it was through working on him that I guess I became more more interested in this kind of more like situating the kind of case histories within history, if you know what I mean.
So the Marxist orientation to psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, etc., that he and his colleagues were engaged in didn't necessarily, what I hear you saying is that it didn't necessarily produce some kind of foundational, Marxiologically informed approach to understanding human subjectivity and desire per se, at least in the case of Luria. And then I also heard you say that really, that Soviet block of research into psychology, psychiatry, and so on is still very much kind of taught and used and so on and so forth. So I guess my question is, it kind of goes back to our question on how the Bolsheviks dealt with psychoanalysis. Like, I guess, and this is opening up a maybe broader question, which is, in this long debate between how do you deal with Marx and Freud, what I like about your work is you're showing actually, well, historically, a lot of people have like literally done that, at a clinical level, right? And so yeah, so like, what does that does that mean that those orientations have like different kind of case studies because of the approach that they take than what you find in other kind of Western, maybe more liberal bourgeois contexts? Like, what are some qualitative sort of things you've noticed in your research of all of these Soviet era psychiatrists and psychoanalysts that kind of open up a new light on this contrast, or is it more complex than that? Is it more varied?
Well, I think one of the striking things, if you read Luria's work, that is that, you know, these are people who are like, you know, these are not bourgeois people living in Vienna. These are kind of people who've lived through a revolution, a civil war, who, even if they're kind of, you know, and who have, he does work, for example, with like orphan children, or it's kind of, he's working in a very particular social and historical context. And so even when he sort of doesn't say anything much of interest about that, it's just empirically like obvious in it's there in the kind of clinical work.
Yeah.
And so I suppose in that sense, and I suppose, yeah, I was interested in how, on the one hand, he goes on and on about how you have to kind of pay attention to the specificities of an environment, etc., whilst kind of often ignoring it. And I think that's also because he has a kind of understanding of environment that also, and development, that actually is also, it's about, and I suppose this is another sense in which it's Marxist, is that they have an understanding of individual development that is a kind of analogy for how they understand historical development to work. And so that in the individual, who goes from sort of baby to child to adult, and who ideally ends up at what would be called a kind of civilized, the ideal kind of civilized adult who is literate, and, you know, it's a kind of normative idea of a sort of ideal subject at the end of this linear trajectory of so there's also this sense in which, and that each stage is marked by a dialectical transformation. So between a baby and a toddler. And so that there's a sense in this sense where it's also, so history means two things. It means how time moves forward and undergoes these kind of qualitative transformations, and that is, they say, similar to how an individual ideally progresses. And it is progressive. But then history also means your environment in some sense, or like stuff that happens around you.
Yeah.
And I think actually that those two understandings of history are not always easy to, they don't coexist very easily, in a sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Kollontai's work on communism and the family, and I was just reading it recently, and like, just speaking here of like, you know, Soviet commentators on this sort of area, you know, so fascinating because she was so concerned with the way that capitalism deteriorates leisure time for the family and locates that and what we call, in the post-war context, the absence of the breadwinner family, right? But she really sucks so much about how a communist society will not be one that will erode the centrality and the importance of constant labor time exerted by both men, women alike, and so on, right? And it's interesting to think of this kind of question of, like you have the burgeoning Soviet society emerging, and you have a kind of like the NEP, the New Economic Policy, which, and of course, they're encircled by civil war and conflict and strife, and then a world war. So you have this kind of model, or you have these sort of like insights of psychoanalysis into subjective life, into the family, into like how to better organize things. And these intellectuals and these psychiatrists and psychologists are utilizing these insights, but they're facing a reality which is so turbulent that it never fully materializes per se. Like it doesn't, right? So it becomes a kind of in gestation or something. It's not fully realized, I guess.
Yeah, I guess that it's something that I think is very palpable in a lot of the theory, this tension between the kind of messy, actual, imperfect present and this sort of ideal communist horizon or something.
Yeah.
And that is kind of, ever present.
Yeah, for sure. I want to make a pivot to your more recent work on burnout and the psychic toil of political struggle. And start by asking you, like, one of the things that we try to do here is sort of say, well, especially for left militants, for Marxists, people engaged in political struggles, like kind of make the argument that psychoanalysis has something to offer, even if you can't afford to do psychoanalysis, like familiarizing yourself with this kind of repertoire of psychoanalytic ideas and concepts actually is helpful. And even like the community building that we try to do has some element of that too. So like, what are you up to with this book, and what's the overview of it, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so I suppose this actually has its origins in my own experiences, insofar as I felt like it seemed so much of a common experience to live through these political defeats, and also the kind of very painful animosities and interpersonal difficulties within political movements, the despair that can follow defeat, and that as an emotional experience, right? And so this book is an attempt to think through the different ways in which activists, revolutionaries on the left, very broadly understood, collectively and in isolation, have kind of attempted to work through or theorize the impacts of their own emotional and political experiences. So it's an attempt to sort of historicize what I guess people colloquially refer to as burnout, but the concept of burnout itself has a very particular history. And so I suppose I jump around a lot historically and geographically, in an attempt to find examples of people dealing with these kinds of experiences of defeat, disillusionment, exhaustion. And so the book is structured around different concepts, all of which, apart from one actually, have a kind of existence within the psi disciplines, like psychiatry, psychoanalysis, etc. So I have chapters on melancholia, trauma, mourning, etc., etc. But I'm always trying to ground them in concrete political examples, historical moments, and to also point out that all of these concepts also have a kind of historical specificity. So the first chapter, for example, is on the concept of nostalgia, which had a very particular definition within 19th century psychiatry in the aftermath of the Paris Commune. Surviving communards who were sent to New Caledonia, kind of colonial archipelago in the Pacific. diagnose themselves with nostalgia, which is a sort of pathological homesickness.
Hmm.
And so I kind of look at the history of these different moments. Or
I didn't know nostalgia was defined so strongly. That's really intense.
Yeah.
I feel like we colloquially use nostalgia just as like, I don't know, like a far more ordinary, more kind of like non-pathological. Like there's like non-pathological nostalgia, but there is a kind of clinical pathology, is what you're saying. There was.
There was, yeah.
Yeah.
And it had a kind of 19th century French origin.
Mm.
And I look actually at the sort of, I look at the two, our more kind of commonplace understanding of nostalgia in relation to this more historically specific pathological understanding, for example.
So that's really interesting. So these are communards who had a nostalgia for what was effectively a tragic defeat, like for what was effectively a moment in history for them, which was not actually like some stable, prosperous, whatever. That's a different kind of nostalgia than the one we are accustomed to today.
I think it's complicated because I think there's a sort of slightly more conservative version of it where you could just say, oh, they were just actually nostalgic for France, or you could define it as a more political nostalgia. They were nostalgic for this kind of political moment that didn't come to pass, or
Okay, that's really helpful as a kind of opening, precisely because of the Arab Spring, the Black Lives Matter. I mean, look at the summer of 2020 and the nostalgia that's already developing amongst people in the American left around Black Lives Matter. I mean, I can only imagine what the Egyptian youth are feeling after Arab Spring. So this becomes like a kind of a recurring horizon of this maybe like paradoxical, like to long for a moment in time in which the world had opened some possibility, which was then foreclosed. But in that little space, how do you sort of not fetishize that, or how do you sort of, because it's interesting, because it's almost like one thing I've been thinking about lately is kind of like, a kind of Marxist tends to not be wax nostalgic for moments in history, such as, say, the welfare state. Like, actually, in reality, the welfare state was used as a tool against the class struggle. Like, it was used as a kind of moderate, like, regulating device. Whereas, like, a Marxist might actually be more interested in looking at moments in history where things didn't maybe succeed, but were on the precipice of something much more possibly revolutionary. Is that kind of what you're getting at, as a kind of like maybe like a different way to read political nostalgia in a way?
It's a kind of an attempt to think a bit differently about left-wing melancholia.
Yeah.
And I suppose, in that chapter on nostalgia, because I'm obviously talking about history, I'm trying to think about, well, is it inevitably kind of moribund and deadening to think about the past, and is it inevitably a form of left-wing melancholia where you just lament and kind of cling on to this kind of fleeting moment of almost success and actually sort of, like you say, kind of reify defeat in the process? Or is there this more enlivening form of relationship to the past where you can kind of, and I think actually there was an essay written by Jason Smith precisely about the Black Lives Matter uprisings that talks about this contrast in different forms of how we commemorate or how we remember, we meaning, I guess, the left in this context. But I guess it's that sort of thing that I'm trying to think through, and to sort of, it is a book about failure and disappointment and people falling out and being awful to each other. And it's trying to kind of, well, how do you talk about that and take it seriously? Because I think people who've experienced those things know how you can't just intellectually get over those things necessarily.
Yeah, I know. It becomes like in the age of austerity. It reminds me of like the Batman scene when he has Bane, and Bane beats Batman to a bloody pulp or whatever. Remember that scene? And before he beats him, he says, I'm going to introduce you to the darkness. And he says precisely like, I've been in the darkness far longer than you, and that's why I'm stronger than you. And I always thought about that, like the millennial generation of our time. Like we're getting older now. And so some people that have been militants for a few decades have a certain greater exposure to the darkness in a way. And then that becomes kind of like, okay, how do you use that wisdom of your defeat proactively for younger people, things like that, right? How do you sort of have a kind of transmission of that, right? Is interesting to me. How do you fit mourning into this question? Does mourning appear here for you in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I've written before a little bit about Douglas Crimp's Mourning and Militancy, which I find a really helpful way of thinking about the Joe Hill's famous kind of sort of command, don't mourn, organize. And often in the wake of political defeats, you see it even now on Twitter, people will say, oh, don't mourn, organize, right? And it's easy to say that, but actually, well, how can you mourn and organize? Because I think part of the book is saying like, no, it's important to mourn, and we have to find ways of being able to mourn, and also to acknowledge that like that it isn't always possible to just sort of and like it can even be more damaging, corrosive to individuals, but also damaging to collectivity, kind of to kind of just try and pretend that you can just kind of get up and carry on, and to not actually take stock of the very real forms of loss, and like, I mean, obviously literal death in many cases. The other book that I talk about in some detail is a book by the psychoanalyst Raluca Soriano. It's about the June Days movement in Brazil. It's a fairly recent book, and I found it really helpful. She talks a lot. She kind of relies more heavily on Ferenczi than on Freud, but again, kind of reworks it for thinking. And she talks a lot about how the crowd is also a space of mourning. So we might often think about how crowds together, collectivities gathering on the streets, is kind of euphoric or angry, and that's true. But she's also talking about how the protest itself, demonstrations themselves, can be spaces of mourning. And I think that's obviously true in the case of many kind of riots, or you can think of, I think, many historical examples where it's quite literally the case that it is a form of mourning. And so I think it's also to try to think about, well, mourning is a form of protest in some sense, and that mourning is a form of collectivity. It's not just a contrast to it. And that it can also, I think she sees it as, in some sense, also it is a form of mourning, but it has a kind of, it's reparative, right? It's not. It's interesting. So I think that's kind of what I'm trying to think through in talking about mourning.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, the dialectic of kind of these movements from, alter globalization to Occupy to BLM, like I've always been fascinated with that periodization, and how in fact there's a kind of interlinkage of these of the emergence of these social movements, but that it's not always coordinated, it's not always organized. And we've been on my show kind of having people kind of talk about the debate there around political organization in the context of the fact that you can have such random emergence of protest energy and kind of the masses in revolt, which sort of lack sort of the relay channel to institutions to sort of have their wider grievances, their wider demands adequately met, becomes this kind of major political conundrum of our time. So that's really helpful. So what are some other things you're trying to do are you trying to sort of offer a kind of guidebook to political militants in the book? Are you trying to sort of like offer, I don't know, like, I don't want to be cute, but like, is political militancy also kind of therapeutic? Because I personally feel that it is, but then obviously that's kind of not fair to say that. But like, is there how do you broach that idea? Like how do you use therapy? How do you use therapeutic modalities when you're a political militant? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also an interesting question, and certainly I think there's plenty of examples historically of people framing, like I do the revolution as a form of, maybe they wouldn't call it therapy, but as a form of kind of I need to sort of thing. Or I suppose you also have a kind of, if you go back to this sort of Bolshevik thing, it's more like I sacrifice myself for the collective. But that obviously, it's easy enough to say that, and actually, well, you see these examples of people really, being doing incredible kind of forms of self-sacrifice. But it's not like that didn't come at a kind of psychic cost to people either. And so I guess I'm interested in all of these kinds of contradictions, and I don't really talk. It's quite a depressing book. I was like trying to make it a bit more. I was trying to think of ways of sort of alternating between these kind of incredibly depressing chapters with something a bit more hopeful, or like counter examples of sort of moments of euphoria, or moments of like militancy as a kind of form of maybe psychological healing or something. But I didn't end up writing anything like that, unfortunately, maybe.
Do you engage with the widely read Korean German theorist Byung-Chul Han in his notion of burnout? In passing. Uh-huh. What do you think of his work in general?
I mean, I only read the Burnout book and one other. Like, they're very short, right?
They're very short.
Isn't there one on the Death Drive? I think I have it.
Yeah, it's new. That's the latest.
I read that one. Yeah. I keep meaning to read it. It's like sitting on a pile somewhere.
Uh-huh.
But I think I don't engage in any great detail, because I guess I suppose what I'm not doing is talking about how life under capitalism makes people unwell. I'm talking more about, well, how like fighting to overthrow it can also be very damaging, and how we who are committed to doing that might be able to find ways of somehow I don't know, addressing it. Certainly not a handbook. I kind of maybe wish that I got to the end of reading all this stuff and had some more like, look, here's a really helpful thing that some people did. There's a chapter in it where I talk quite a lot about like consciousness raising practices and kind of self-criticism, because I was interested in when the left or different kind of liberation movements have come up with these kind of small group practices that are about transforming the individual. They're not therapy. They're explicitly contrasted to therapy. But I was interested in thinking about, well, what theory of the subject do these things rely on?
Yeah.
And like, how can people who are interested in the unconscious also think about this history of like consciousness and consciousness raising? So I don't know. I kind of tried to come at it at a few different angles.
It's incredible. Yeah, we look forward to checking that out. And your Substack is really, really fascinating, because I mean, just to give it like a brief plug, and I'll link to it. You are really able somehow to sort of bring these psychoanalytic figures that we had forgotten from the dustbin of history, kind of like this history from below thesis in general, and sort of like bring them up to the surface and say, okay, here's what they thought, and here's sort of how we can use their ideas today. And you also write a kind of column, is that right? A kind of op-ed sort of, you do is that fair to say? What is that kind of writing that you do?
I have a regular column, I guess it's a column, in the Tribune magazine, which the culture section, which is edited by Owen Hatherley. And there's kind of there's a sort of few people who, and I'm one of them, who are kind of regular contributors. And I think when he first invited me to do it, it would be like there will be the sort of literature person and the film person, and I was kind of the psychology person, which is funny, I don't think all culture sections have one of those. So the first piece that he commissioned me to write was about Jordan Peterson, but actually I have written some stuff.
So you got it. Okay, now what's your take on Peterson briefly, and then we'll let you go soon. But like, what's I remember reading it, but it was a few months ago.
Um,
What's the
I
breakdown?
mean, I read it when it was like really hot in Berlin, like really so hot that you couldn't think. And there's no air conditioning there. So it's like I was like only like vaguely able to use my brain. I felt like I was like melting and reading these sentences that are just like completely bananas, like so strange. Because I think it's not just that it's like evil and stupid, it's just like so weird and like makes no sense. And so I think I was kind of, and I did actually, because I think that the angle that he was interested in was like, well, Peterson's engagement with Jung. And so I did actually read a lot of Jung and was like, wow, I hate this.
Yeah, so tell us. So yeah, Jordan Peterson is a Jungian. We've mentioned before that there's this wonderful way to kind of look at the politics of Jung by looking at Richard Knoll's book called The Jung Cult, which I highly recommend to everyone. But like, could you say like, how is Jordan Peterson a good reader of Carl Jung?
I mean, he's like, so there are kind of tropes that are there, right? Which is, it's this very sort of like, almost like like the kind of aesthetic is very like, almost like Warcraft or something. Like it's like, or like Lord of the Rings. It's very like, there's some wizards, there's some like ancient waterfalls, there's like, just like, I mean, this kind of world that they do have in common, yes. But I think that I think I said in my piece, which is a kind of I did a sort of like pastiche of Peterson's style in my kind of hot, like too hot frenzy, brain didn't work kind of thing, where I think I described it as like, it's like watching a Muppet Lohengrin. So it's like in Jung, you have you have these same tropes, but they have a kind of like a kind of sort of gravitas in a certain way, and it's also like deeply politically bad, but it sort of has this kind of gravitas. Whereas in Peterson, it's all hellfire and brimstone, but it's kind of this bizarre mix of kind of hell and like your pencil case or whatever. Like it's such a bizarre mix of like from this kind of between registers. So it just switches from this very intense kind of eternal like burn in hell stuff to like the most mundane self-help kind of stuff imaginable. And it's like these very abrupt gear changes. And so, for example, I think, like your Peterson has this like very long lecture called like Carl Jung and the Lion King. So it's like he takes Jung and then applies it to these kind of pop cultural objects. So it's just bizarre.
So he's using Jung as a kind of authoritative theoretical master to kind of further the grift, or further the kind of the self-help project. But is he also invoking Jung in a kind of like to grant a certain theoretical sort of legitimacy to his project, that like, okay, well, I'm a master of this great philosopher psychologist Carl Jung, and now that is there a bit of that going on there? Or like, how is Jung utilized by Peterson? Like, what end does he serve for the project of Peterson?
100% conferring legitimacy, like that's definitely one of the things. But it's also, I think, there is something about his vision of the world with these kind of stable, eternal, like these kind of archetypes and things, but that it's like, so it's a kind of, but that like in a kind of slightly euphemistic way in Peterson's work, but that it's obvious that this is like used to defend a kind of world of a kind of white male civilization, and yeah, like I think to sort of make these claims seem as if they're actually based on some sort of like science or whatever. Like his whole thing about lobsters is also kind of draws on this like scientific study or whatever. So it's like a kind of way of him saying his like deeply misogynistic, deeply racist stuff, but making it seem like it's like based on,
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Well, This has been really nice. Thanks for coming on the show and joining me to chat about all of your really interesting research. And I think folks definitely will benefit from reading Hannah's work. We'll link to, your Substack and your books and everything like that.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was a blast.
It made sense. I sometimes
Maybe we'll have to invite you back to give maybe a presentation when your book comes out with Verso. We would love to bring you back. I think many of our people will really resonate because we're very much a global association or study group. So yeah, I think it will definitely resonate.
That would be great.
So okay, all the best.
Thanks.
See you next time.